So as John mentioned, the Iowa Agriculture Water Alliance was founded by three leading Iowa Ag Association, the Corn Growers, the Soybean Association, and the Iowa Pork Producers Association. And our mission is to increase the pace and scale of farmer-led efforts to improve water quality. So we're organized around helping to improve the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy, and in some later slides we'll talk in detail about that. But I wanted to start off talking about water quality and a common misperception that many people labor under, that somehow if only farmers wouldn't stop over-fertilizing, we wouldn't have any water quality problems. And that's a misperception that a lot of urban folks share. So I wanted to share some data with you, courtesy of USDA, that really tells a very different story. If you look on the far left, you've got 1980 on the x-axis to 2014. So in that 34-year period, fertilizer use in the corn sector in the United States went up only about 4.5%. But if you look at the yields on corn, they went up 114%. So take those two numbers and put them together, and that yields a 105% increase in efficiency. That is just a staggering increase in a short amount of time, 34 years. So we'd be hard-pressed to find another sector that's making those strides as farmers are. So increasingly, corn farmers are being more efficient about their nutrient stewardship, and they're using the right form of fertilizer in the right rate at the right time and the right place. And pork producers have been making great strides as well in their applications and incorporation using precision ag to be more efficient. So I wanted to pivot to some national statistics and then talk about some regional and state challenges for water quality. So despite that increase in nutrient use efficiency, we do have our water quality challenges in the nation, and Iowa is not alone in that. So we have over 100,000 miles of impacted rivers and streams. This is according to EPA's data, what they characterize as nutrient pollution. Over 160 hypoxic areas in the country, and 27% of river and stream miles having excess nitrate concentrations, and 40% having high phosphorus concentrations. So shifting to a regional look and looking at the Mississippi River Basin, in the upper Miss, we do have our challenges, particularly around nitrogen, nitrate concentrations. This shows over half of our wadable streams having high nitrates, significantly less for phosphorus. We've actually made great strides in recent decades at reducing soil erosion and therefore reducing sedimentation and phosphorus in our waterways. But we really have a lot of work to go still when it comes to reducing nitrate concentrations. So one of the drivers of our work here in Iowa and the kind of centralizing organizing principle of the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy is Gulf hypoxia. And this is important because it really impacts us here in Iowa. The Nutrient Reduction Strategy is aligned with the Gulf Hypoxia Action Plan, which calls for reducing nutrients in the Gulf. And unfortunately, excess nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, lead to what's called the hypoxic zone or the dead zone, where it causes algal blooms, and then as the algae die off, that takes a lot of oxygen out of the water. So particularly at the very bottom of the water column, there's not enough oxygen for things like shrimp and fish to survive. So that's really a driver of a lot of the interest around water quality here in Iowa. So let's look at where the nutrients are coming from. And this probably is not a new slide for you, but according to the U.S. Geological Survey, this shows where the highest concentrations of nitrate are coming from on the left part of the screen and phosphorus on the right. And Iowa is a big source of both. We're among the top 3 contributing states for nitrogen and among the top 7 for phosphorus. And according to USGS, agriculture is the dominant contributor of nutrients. If you look at nitrogen, it accounts for about 51% of all the nitrogen going into the Gulf. And if you look at phosphorus, it accounts for about 49%. So different scientists got together under the auspices of the Gulf Hypoxia Action Plan, and they calculated that if we're able to get a 45% reduction in nitrogen and phosphorus, then we'll be able to shrink the size of Gulf hypoxia by about 2/3. So this slide here shows the size of Gulf hypoxia, and for the last 5 years, there's been an average of about 6,000 square miles. And the thinking behind the strategy is that if we're able to get that 45% reduction, we'll be able to shrink the size of Gulf hypoxia to 2,000 square miles, which was the average between 1980 and 1996. So that's the driver behind that. So just shifting to looking at water quality at the statewide scale, we do have our challenges in Iowa. This is a slide from DNR that shows impaired waterways, over 200 impairments in lakes and about 600 in river and stream segments in Iowa. So looking at why we have these challenges in Iowa, particularly when Iowa farmers are being more efficient at their nutrient utilization, we've got to look at factors like soil fertility, climate, and weather. So this slide here shows soil organic matter, or soil carbon. If you look at that legend on the left-hand side where it says low to high, and the high being very dark. If you look at Iowa, we really have just this phenomenal concentration of some of the world's most fertile soils. So that's the reason why we're so productive in terms of agriculture in the state. But it is a double-edged sword in that the higher soil organic matter you have, the more vulnerable your soils are to leaching nitrate. Now, if you look at the lower right-hand side of that screen, not sure if I have a laser pointer here. Oops. This shows when we get our precipitation in the state. Just walk down here. So you can see this dotted line shows our monthly precipitation pattern. And this red curve here shows when our crops, our corn and soybeans, are utilizing nitrate. So in the summer, we really do not have a problem with nitrate concentrations in our waterways because the crops are utilizing it. Where we do have a problem that's most acute is in the spring, right before and right after planting, before the crops are established, and also in the fall after the crops stop growing. So when we have bare soil, as we often do with in our corn, soybean, or continuous corn rotation, we're extremely vulnerable to nitrate loss during these periods of spring and fall when we get a lot of our rain. So one effective strategy to mitigate that is cover crops. Cover crops are very effective at scavenging for nitrogen, particularly ones like winter rye, and holding that nitrogen back for the next crop. And if you have a winter hardy cover crop, they're effective at reducing erosion as well. So soil fertility is a big factor in water quality, as is land use when you look at when we're most vulnerable to leaching nitrates. And let's take a deeper look at land use. Again, we've seen how farmers are making great progress at the field scale in being more efficient with their nutrient utilization. But there have been major changes in the state that have exacerbated our challenges. So this slide shows acres of different crops over the years. And you'll see corn is here at a little over 13 million acres. Soybeans is here at a little under 10 million acres. So we've got about 23 million acres of row crops in the state. If you look at where we were in 1950, there were about 10 million acres less of those two crops, particularly soybeans. and there were about 10 million acres more of things like pasture and small grains, so oats, wheat, barley, rye, things like that. So those crops were displaced by corn and soybeans, and so when we did have more pasture and more of those small grain crops, which are sometimes called sod crops, we had more roots, more vegetation in the spring and the fall when we do get a lot of our rain. So we had more plants that were able to utilize that nitrate. So the scale has exacerbated our challenges as far as water quality, and that's one thing that makes having cover crops even more important, because that could take up some of those acres. So wanted to talk about the nitrogen cycle, and these slides are courtesy of Iowa State and Dr. Castellano. But these slides really help to dispel that common misperception that a lot of people have about, if only farmers would stop over-fertilizing, our water quality problems would be solved. So this shows the nitrogen cycling budget for corn. And as we discussed, we have incredibly rich soils in Iowa. In fact, the average acre of Iowa farmland has 10,000 pounds of organic nitrogen. That's almost an unlimited bank of nitrogen, which due to natural processes, when our soils become warm and moist, some of that converts to nitrate, about 100 to 400 pounds a year. Now, of course, in corn, the average farmer's putting down about 150 pounds of nitrate, and the crop is utilizing about 165 pounds. Now, we have a very leaky system if we don't have buffers around our corn and soybeans, and if we don't have cover crops there in the spring and the fall. And so on average, about 30 pounds of nitrate leaches off per acre per year of corn. Let's look at soybeans. So for soybeans, of course, we have the same amount of organic nitrogen in the soil, and we have the same amount of conversion to nitrate. But of course, with soybeans, farmers aren't applying any nitrogen fertilizer. Yet, we have the same amount of nitrate leaching off an acre of soybeans as corn, 30 pounds. So that really helps to dispel that misperception. If a corn farmer is putting down 150 pounds and 30 pounds are leaching off, and a soybean farmer is putting down 0, but the same amount is leaching off, that really illustrates how there's a lot more going on here than just fertilizer management. And this really does have to do more with soil fertility and weather and climate. And really our nitrate concentrations in our waterways are most highly correlated to weather and precipitation. So the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy, as I mentioned, is aligned with that Gulf Hypoxia Action Plan, and it has the same goal of reducing nitrogen and phosphorus loss by 45%. And the lion's share of that reduction would come from agriculture, a non-point source, 41% of the nitrogen and 29% of the phosphorus. So this is a very ambitious strategy, and the strategy has a few different scenarios that calls for various combinations of practices to result in that nutrient reduction loss. So one of the scenarios estimates about $4 billion for implementation costs. Then there'd be some annual costs. But there are different scenarios, different range in costs. But it really is going to take transformational change to get there. At our current rate of investment, it would take a couple centuries before we have enough funding to bring about those big reductions. And of course, we really want to increase that pace and scale. We want to do it in a matter of decades. And I like to say that our water quality problems are complex in Iowa, and there's no silver bullet. There's no one practice that will improve water quality and get us to those reduction goals. However, if we use the right combination of practices, both in-field and edge-of-field practices, they're silver buckshot, and we will be able to achieve those goals. So just looking at some of those practices, we mentioned cover crops already and improved nutrient management, but conservation tillage, strip till and no-till, those are additional infield practices that are particularly good for reducing phosphorus by reducing soil erosion. And then there's edge-of-field practices like bioreactors, saturated buffers, nutrient treatment wetlands that are very effective at reducing nitrate concentrations. So I know we're going to hear from Rob and John a little bit more about cover crops, and I think John's going to talk about saturated buffers as well. But I did want to just touch on cover crops. So about 5 years ago, it was estimated that we had 10,000 acres of cover crops. Today, we have about 500,000. So that's a phenomenal increase. We really are making great strides there. However, that's still only about 2% of all the row crop acres in the state. You know, some estimates for implementing the nutrient reduction strategy call for around 70% of our row crop acres having cover crops. So that's looking more like 17 million acres of cover crops. Well, unfortunately, there's not enough cover crop seed in the nation to plant 17 million acres. So we really have some big infrastructure gaps. So while we have been making great progress in cover crops, we're still just scratching the surface, and there's a lot more we need to do as far as scaling up. Let's turn to some other practices. Oh, actually, before we do, this shows edge-of-field monitoring, so water quality monitoring. And this shows with cover crops, if you look on the left-hand side, this shows nitrate concentrations with cover crops. And then if you look at the right, this shows without cover crops. And this is in the Boone River watershed. If you look at the far right, the turquoise color, this shows water quality data in the stream. So Lyons Creek, Eagle Creek, and White Fox Creek. So you can see the light blue without cover crops. You see much higher nitrate concentrations than in the green. Those are fields that have cover crops. So those are very, very effective at reducing nitrate concentrations, particularly when you have those cover crop varieties that are effective nitrogen scavengers. So turning to some of the edge-of-field practices, this shows a bioreactor, which is basically a trench of wood chips and a drainage control structure. The drainage control structure intercepts the tile and diverts water into the wood chips. Bacteria in the wood chips are able to convert the nitrate. They're able to utilize that and convert it into a harmless nitrogen gas, very effective at reducing nitrate concentrations. This shows a picture of the drainage control structure being installed on the left, and then the wood chips being added on the right. If you look at the graph in the lower right, this shows the nitrate concentrations in the black dots where water is flowing into the tile, and then in the red dots you can see where water is flowing out of the tile. So you can see really marked reductions in nitrate concentrations from bioreactors. Next, I wanted to talk about saturated buffers, and I believe John will be saying more about this, but this is similar in that you also have a drainage control structure that intercepts the tile line, diverts water, so it's parallel to the stream and the field, and then the vegetation in the field, in the buffer, is able to take up the nitrates. So another very effective practice. Now, we were talking about scale. We have about 50 different bioreactors in the state, but under one scenario of the nutrient reduction strategy, it calls for 180,000. So we really do have to increase our pace and scale of implementation. Prairie strips is another practice that's effective at reducing runoff, reducing nitrogen by nearly 90%, as well as phosphorus. And one very promising innovation is looking at profitability at the subfield scale. You know, looking at which acres make money and which acres lose money. If we're able to treat every acre as a separate business unit, we can make decisions that really increase our return on investment. So these next few slides, courtesy of AgSolver, show in red where a field is losing money, up to $300, $400, $500 an acre in red, and where it's making money, up to $300, $400, $500 in green. By looking at each acre as a separate business unit and making a decision of taking those acres that aren't profitable out of production, we can see ROI increase immensely. So this slide here shows a particular field, 50-year average, 170 bushels per acre, average profit being $47 an acre. If you take those acres that are losing $250 or more per year out of production, you can see the profit average goes up to $76 an acre. So I did want to close just by talking about the importance of working at the watershed scale. This slide here shows our priority watersheds within the state, and wanted to talk about one particular watershed in the Upper Cedar and Rock Creek, where farmers have gotten together and they have adopted the goals of the nutrient reduction strategy and said, we're going to have a 41% reduction in nitrate loss. And then, along with the Iowa Soybean Association, they figured out, okay, what practices do we need to get there? So they looked at bioreactors. Where would bioreactors be the most effective? They looked at nutrient treatment wetlands. They looked at cover crops, really blanketing the row crop acres. They looked at drainage control structures. And they looked at improved nutrient management and said, okay, if we scale up those practices, it'll cost about $5 million. And they said, we're going to do this in 20 years. So this could be one of the first watersheds that does achieve the goals of the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy and also the Gulf Hypoxia Action Plan. So we need more of this kind of watershed planning at our priority watershed scale throughout Iowa.